Hi everybody, this is Miss Wilson and welcome to your last lecture of Unit 1 in AP Environmental Science. So we're going to wrap up chapters 1 and 2 here by starting to talk about developing solutions to environmental issues. So this is going to put together those ideas of making sure that our policies are sustainable by actually putting into law all of these issues that we're talking about, considering the economics behind it, considering the ethics behind it, and coming up with policies. All right, so when you're looking at environmental solutions, you want to look at them from one of two viewpoints, either prevention or cleanup of existing problems. We obviously want to try to prevent environmental problems as much as possible, because when you're trying to clean them up or mitigate those problems, a lot of times these are temporary fixes. You don't fix the technology itself, so it's a reoccurring problem. Sometimes you are taking a pollutant from one area just to put it in another one, or if you're taking a pollutant out in total, it can cause trouble when you're trying to do that. The process itself can be polluting. And then a lot of times when you have a pollutant at a harmful level, it's going to cost a lot of money to remove it. So we want to try to prevent pollution as much as possible. This goes along with this idea of a precautionary principle, which basically says that we don't want to wait around before and wait for the environment to be damaged. We want to stop the pollution from happening in the first place. So San Francisco actually took the lead with this, and in 2005 they passed an ordinance that required the city to try to look for safer alternatives to any traditional products or practices that could possibly have negative environmental or health effects, even if science hadn't yet proved that they had. And there's basically 5 parts to this. They said, first of all, that everybody should be acting in an anticipatory way, meaning that everybody has the duty to prevent harm, and they should try to do that as much as possible. Number 2, everybody has a right to know what things are going to do to the environment and to their own bodies. Number 3, there should be an alternatives assessment. You should look at all the different possible alternatives and figure out which one is the best, again, for your personal health and also for the environment. And then 4, you should take all of the costs into account. So this is called full cost accounting. You should look at all the benefits and the risks involved. It's called a risk-benefit analysis. And number 5, it should be a participatory decision process. So everybody should have a voice. All citizens should be talking to each other, the government talking to each other. Everyone should, the businesses should all be coming together to decide what the best course of action should be, and that would be how you apply this precautionary principle. Another thing that you should be aware of, people come up with these EISs, or environmental impact statements. This was actually put into law in 1970, which was when the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was formed. It also was formed as part of NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, also written into effect in that year. And it basically said that the federal government has to consider the environmental impact of any project that they do. So basically they have to come up with this document, this environmental impact statement, that talks about the nature of the project and why you need to do it. So it could be building a dam, building a highway, something like that. It needs to talk about the short and long-term environmental impacts of that project, how it's going to affect the surrounding area, and any alternatives that you could do, or better practices that you could put in place to reduce or mitigate, that would be, again, afterwards address those impacts. So a lot of times these environmental impact statements will include things like how the project is going to affect wildlife habitat, how the landscape's going to be altered, if it's going to impact any endangered species or stream flow in the area, water quality, air quality, how you're going to deal with any increased erosion from the project, things like that. So it is in the federal law and in most state laws now that anyone who's going to perform a project that will impact the environment has to write one of these EISs first. So now that you have some background, let's talk about the 5 general stages to addressing environmental problems. So you always want to start off with a scientific assessment of the problem. And this goes along with that whole idea of the scientific method, which you should be familiar with. If you need to look back at that at any point, make sure that you do that. But basically, they're going to conduct experiments to see what's causing the problem and make sure that we're clear on what the causes are and how we could improve that. So that's the first thing they do. Then they would want to follow that by a risk analysis, which is basically when they're going to identify any potential effects of doing nothing and also the effects of intervening, and look at the different costs and benefits of each of those things. So much like your cost-benefit analysis that you did in class. After the risk analysis, then comes public education and involvement. You want the public to know why you're doing this. Otherwise, your policies aren't going to really be followed. They need to be aware that there is a good reason behind it. And then comes your political action. And again, here you should be hopefully familiar with how a bill becomes a law from your government class. But if you need to, go ahead and look back at this page here or this one here, which can kind of give you a little review of how that process works. Just make sure that, again, you're aware of how we actually put things into law. And then finally, after the political action, you want to follow it up with some kind of evaluation. Was this effective? Did it do what we wanted it to do? If not, how are we going to move forward? So these are the 5 major steps. These are idealistic because, again, real life isn't always nice and neat like this, but most environmental problems are solved somewhat in this way. And in class, next class, you're going to be modeling this. So for an example of how these 5 steps could be put into place, we're going to use a case study that is also in your book if you should need to look back at it. And this is a case study of Lake Washington in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So Lake Washington is a large freshwater lake, and you can kind of see that it's near Seattle, and it's kind of not really quite connected to Puget Sound, but it's nearby. And what was happening is in the 1940s, a lot of cities were built up here. So a huge population was coming in, and we were starting to see what we call suburban sprawl, where houses are just being built in every direction, lots of development. So because of this huge new population, we had 10 new sewage treatment plants that are surrounding the lake, and they're all starting to dump their effluent, which is just their discharged treated sewage, into the lake. And what we saw happening as an effect of that is cyanobacteria started to grow excessively on top of the lake, and it formed this smelly green scum. And the problem with that is that when these things are living, okay, they're using up some nutrients in the water, that's not too bad, but when they start to die and decompose, the bacteria that are actually decomposing them are using up oxygen in that process of cellular respiration while they're decomposing the cyanobacteria. And when they use up the oxygen, they're taking it out of the water. So that means that all the fish, all the other aquatic life that's in there no longer has the oxygen that they need to survive. So we started seeing these massive dead zones where there's nothing alive. And this process is called eutrophication. We'll actually see it a bunch more times this year. So the first step that they did was that scientific assessment. They did a couple studies. Basically, both studies found really high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in the lake. That is not normal for a deep water lake. They're usually low in those nutrients. So they were hypothesizing that the treated sewage was introducing those nutrients, and then those nutrients were causing the growth of the cyanobacteria. So they did a couple studies that confirmed this. And then the community started doing a risk analysis. So they looked at lots of different options for what they could do to fix the problem. And after looking at all their options and their costs and their benefits, they decided that they were going to build a ring of sewers around the lake, and that those sewers would collect the effluent and treat it again before discharging it into Puget Sound. So they picked a new location to put the effluent. And the advantage of Puget Sound is that it's a marine ecosystem. It's not fresh water, and it has tides, which are going to mix the water. So the cyanobacteria aren't going to collect and stay on the surface. They'll get washed into the deeper water, and then since these perform photosynthesis, in that deep water there won't be enough light. They can't do the photosynthesis. It kind of gets rid of the problem. It still means there's extra nutrients, but at least they're somewhere where it's not influencing them quite as much. So after they'd come up with this solution, the next step was to get the public involved and to try to educate them on why those changes were necessary. So in 1957, they actually put out a referendum on the ballot to form a regional government, and that government was supposed to manage the water supply, the sewage and garbage disposal, the transportation, parks, and planning in all of these communities around Seattle. That referendum was voted down because the citizens were afraid that they were going to be taxed for all the city expenses in Seattle, and they didn't think that was fair. So they revised the bill and made it just for sewage management. And then that passed. And at the time, this was the most ambitious and expensive pollution control project ever in the US. So it finally passed and by 1963, they were able to start these projects. They had the first plant up and running. So every household was actually paying taxes towards this. It cost the citizens quite a bit of money, but they had to do it or they would not have the resources that they were depending on anymore. And it worked. So by 1975, the cyanobacteria were totally gone. That didn't start really happening until about 1968, which was when that last sewage treatment plant in the ring was built. But it's a success story. If we look at the data, we can see that the amount of phosphorus went down. And then, of course, the chlorophyll, which tells us how many cyanobacteria were there, also went down in response. And you can also tell that this is due to the amount of dissolved phosphorus that's in that sewage effluent, because as they took out more phosphorus, then the amount of phosphorus in the water went down. So that sewage that had a direct effect on the phosphorus level in the water. And again, that had a direct effect on how many cyanobacteria were in the water. So it's a success story, and it's a great example of how people work together through these 5 steps to solve an environmental problem. So that's part of what you're going to be doing in class next time. You're going to get a situation where you have a potential environmental problem. You're going to do a risk assessment and come up and look at some environmental impact statements and come up with a solution for this problem. And then that will wrap up our unit and hopefully kind of pull together everything about perspectives, environmental ethics, and environmental laws. So we'll see you tomorrow. Please don't forget to also read that article as it said on your blue paper. Thank you. Good night.